I've set up a series of tutorials on knots, and this one is the primer, if you will, for ropes and knots, so that we don't have problems with terminology later. I can only request that you see this video first, because as I start mentioning terms later on in some of the more advanced knots, as we get to them, you're going to come to a stage where you will need to have heard this video to understand what the terms are. Okay, with regard to ropes in general, ropes have been around forever and a day. I think they started back in the days of Egypt. They're made out of a variety of things. The earliest ropes were tree bark that was stripped off of a tree and cut into thin slices like spaghetti and braided together to create a rope. But ropes come in a variety of types. There's hemp, like they have in the old shipping ropes. There are nylon braided ropes. There are polyester braided ropes with a core to them. They come in a variety of strands. Some ropes have as little as 3 strands. Many now used for climbing and things of that nature are 12, 16, and 24 strand. An example of the difference between a braided rope with a core is right here. There's your core and there's the braid. An example of a nylon rope, which is much stronger, nylon is, and this is more like cordage, and it would be used for something like a trucker's hitch or something that we'll be discussing down the line. When you are working with a rope, you will have always a standing end, which is affixed to something and stationary, and then you will have the end that you are using to manipulate and tie something. So you would have this maybe tied to here and stationary, and this is the end you're going to be working with. So you've got a standing end and a working end, or sometimes it's referred to as a running end. Now, before you begin working with any rope, the rope itself is going to have a tendency, when it was cut, to be frayed, and it will continue to fray, and these things will get in your way while you're doing your work. So the initial thing to do would be, with all your ropes, would be to simply cut that, and the piece that you have left over, you'll want to burn it. And I will just caution you before you do, I always use a stick or something, because there's been plenty of times that I've burned myself in the process, because this outer sheath is kind of a polyester, and that tends to melt. But by applying a flame to it until the rope catches on fire, you can let it burn for a little while, just blow it out and take a stick and kind of fashion it so that it comes to a point, because you never know what you're going to have to stick the rope through, and you don't want a great big old clunky knot of glue at the end of it. And just because you have now cleaned up the knot doesn't mean that it's not still hot. It is. And I would be very cautious at first in touching it. Now it's cooled down and I can do anything I want to with it. But that said, this is much more amenable to working with. Knots in general are used to tie things. And generally speaking, there are 3 types of knots, depending on what use you have in mind for them, and the need for security. How secure do they need to be? What is it you're going to do with the knot? It's kind of a cost trade-off between your time and the need for added security. If it's just tying a package, I don't see where that would be requiring of that much security. But if you yourself are suspending your body from the line, and death is part of the picture, that becomes much more a security issue. So knots come in basically three varieties. You have just knots that you tie. You have hitches, which tend to bind upon themselves. As you tie the knot binds to itself, making it less likely to come unraveled. And then there are friction hitches, which are extremely binding. An example of time versus the security and where you need to make the decision. The rope that we just burned the end of, let's say, for example, in this hole, I needed to tie something to let something hang from. Okay, I'm coming up through the hole, and I'm going to tie the simplest of all knots, and all of you probably know this. It's just a granny knot, and it goes like that. Now if I tighten this knot down and set it in a hole, it will hold something. I would not want it to hold me, because as the weight increases, that knot can slide through the hole. So in general, when you go to use knots, number one, you must know your knots. You have to have a good assortment of them to work with, a fair amount of vocabulary with respect to kinds of knots, and understand what they can do, and more importantly, what they can't do. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next video.